Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Amy Ambrose, Chair of the Fuel Poverty Research Network, and welcome to the final session of the conference. We're so nearly there now. It's been another really jam-packed day. The pace of the action hasn't really slowed down for the last day. In fact, I think it's speeded up. We even snuck in a sneaky lunchtime session there, which I hope you enjoyed and that you've actually managed to find time for some lunch. Please hang in there for the last 90 minutes because I'm joined here by some of the most prominent thought leaders in the field of energy poverty. We've got Dr. Brenda Boardman, Professor Gordon Walker, Professor Stefan Buzarowski, and Dr. João Pedro Gouveia. So in terms of how this session's going to run, I'm just going to kick off by sharing some fairly random reflections on the conference and to tell you a bit about who's actually been here, who you've been talking to, and the level of engagement that we've achieved over the last 4 days. Excuse me. We'll then hear from our esteemed panel. They'll present for around, or talk for around 10 minutes each. There'll then be about 30 minutes for questions and answers, and then I'll return briefly to tell you a little bit about how we're planning to create a legacy for this conference so that it's hopefully more of a beginning for new collaborations and new lines of inquiry than an end point. So in my view, this has been quite a big event, I think, for a relatively small field. It shouldn't be a small field. Energy poverty is a global issue, but I think the field is still relatively small. I'll tell you exactly how big, excuse me, the event's been in a moment with some stats that Liz has provided. But my personal view is that the size of the event and the diversity of perspectives we've been able to accommodate over quite a long program of 4 days has really made a big difference in terms of how much detail we've been able to drill down into. It's felt quite different to previous events that certainly the FPRN has run. So when we've had these smaller events in the past, I feel like we've talked about the energy poor, almost as though they're a homogenous group. I think here we've been able to be much more nuanced. We've talked about the different ways that energy poverty comes about, how it manifests, how it's experienced between different groups, regions, countries, and contexts. And there's also been lots of space to reflect on the intersections between energy poverty and other policy priorities, particularly decarbonisation, as is the focus of the conference. So personally, I've been particularly struck and quite affected really by the work that's been presented around the disproportionate impact of energy poverty on women and children. There seemed to be some really powerful evidence coming out of Spain in relation to those two issues, and surely it's a priority for us all to pay some quite urgent attention to those issues, those inequalities within both the research and the policy communities around the world to establish the extent of these differential impacts and their consequences. And I'd even go as far as to say, I think that the interactive session we ran on Monday on gender, which was a particular highlight for me, I feel it should be mandatory training for everybody working in the field so that they come into it aware of the gender dimensions of the problem that are so easy to overlook, I think, when we're all so used to living with those inequalities on a day-to-day basis. So I've also been struck, just to mention a couple of things, there's been so many noteworthy things to come out of the last few days, but I've been struck by the extent to which lived experience research has been championed throughout the conference, something I'm really pleased about. And as Jez Hall from Shared Future put it when he contributed a presentation yesterday, not talking about the lived experience has a dehumanizing effect. And I think I would really second that. I think although many of the statistics shared have been hard-hitting and very effectively conveyed the scale of the problem, the extent of the inequalities, I think it's those human stories certainly that will stay with us the longest and maybe drive us on and make us more passionate about our work in this field. I've also been prompted by the conference to reflect on the role of national and continent-wide energy poverty strategies and directives. And I've been thinking about the extent to which they support and enable action at the local level, the extent to which they take account of the latest research, and whether they do enough to highlight and share localized examples of good practice. And we've had a lot of people championing the importance of local level action where the dynamics of the problem are best perhaps best understood. And finally, I've been thinking about who we're not talking about as much as who we are talking about. And particularly in this regard, I've been thinking about high consumers, who were highlighted in the first panel session of this morning in particular. High consumers never seem to come onto the radar of policymakers. They're barely on the radar of researchers. They consume unchecked, they pollute unchecked, and they almost undoubtedly pollute the neighbourhoods of the energy poor. So surely that's got to be a real priority when we're thinking about just transitions. I'm also thinking on a very big level, thanks to C. Rotman's presentation this morning, about how we can operationalise degrowth in a politically palatable way, rather than always trying to work within the constraints of neoliberalist principles. And that's rather a big one, but I think that's a strand that I'm personally going to hopefully develop in the coming year. So I'd really like it if you could all share your own takeaways from the conference in the chat, share things that have struck a chord with you or that you hope to progress in the coming weeks and months. So we'd love to hear those, and we'll share them with our panel. So in relation to this conference, I think we've got a rather happy story to tell as a result of taking the conference online. Much as we all felt really rather disappointed when it became obvious that we needed to do this and couldn't go to Lisbon. I think largely as a result of going online, this has gone from a relatively small scale event, which would have been open to around 100 people, to what I think, and this might be a controversial and inaccurate statement, I think this might have been one of the largest gatherings of energy poverty researchers and practitioners, certainly that I'm ever aware of. Might be wrong about that, my panelists might correct me on that. But we've had 423 participants register for the event. We've had representatives of every populated continent in the world. Quite why nobody pitched up from Antarctica, I don't know. What are the penguins up to that they couldn't have come to this? I think this has turned out as a result of that massive international representation to be a really great arena in which to share our work, to raise awareness of new and lesser known research directions in the field, and to challenge ourselves to think a bit differently about key debates and the intersections between, particularly in this case, the climate emergency and energy poverty. I think if we'd proceeded with the conference in person, we might have found ourselves in a European echo chamber, perhaps with a separate UK echo chamber on the periphery, of course. And we might well have missed out on all of the insight that we've gained over the last 4 days into the dynamics of energy poverty in the global south. And that's something that I certainly didn't know a huge amount about before this event. I've also heard a number of people remark that they wouldn't have been able to actually give their talk or contribute at all if it wasn't for the online format, and that might have been because of access to funds to travel in from beyond Europe, or because of caring responsibilities, etc., etc. So there could have been an awful lot of people that we'd have inadvertently excluded with an in-person conference. And I look back now and wonder what we were thinking, actually planning to fly to Lisbon, lovely as it is, for a conference that focuses on decarbonisation in inclusivity. Gordon was remarking before the session that one thing he misses is not being able to just have a chat with a colleague he hasn't seen for a long time in the coffee break. And I think we all miss that. And that's a really important part of conferences. And we've been doing some thinking in the debriefs we've been having at the end of the day about how we can get a bit closer to that kind of experience through online events. I think we'll get better at that as time goes on. So one thing I personally found a bit disconcerting, and I'm sure other people will have done too, is not really being able to see the audience that you're talking to. It feels a bit like speaking into a vacuum. But thanks to the Big Brother style monitoring, or maybe spying, that SE2 have been undertaking during the conference, I can tell you who actually was listening. The FPRN always aims to bring together academics and practitioners active in the field. And as Sam Illingworth, one of our earlier contributors, very astutely observed earlier today, it's not just academics that have brilliant ideas. I'd second that, and I would add that it's not just academics that do research either. So happily at this conference, we've had 57 academics engaged and 131 people identifying as researchers. I don't know what sector specifically they belong to. 23 people representing governments or regulatory organisations, 29 industry and supply chain representatives, 87 practitioners, which I think is brilliant, and certainly a record across our FPRN events. I don't know about Engager, and my colleague Jenny will be delighted with that figure on practitioners. We've had 42 people linked to campaigning and advocacy and 44 miscellaneous people. So I think that's a brilliant diversity of contributors, and I think we've all benefited hugely from that diversity of perspectives, and I hope the conference has provided a really good arena for knowledge exchange between those different sectors and for forging new cross-sector collaborations, which is something we always hoped would happen off the back of this. So in terms of who actually pitched up for the sessions, plenaries attracted between 120 and 140 attendees, which I think is brilliant, and panels weren't far behind with between 100 and 120 participants generally. The interactive sessions were a bit smaller, which was always the hope to enable that interactivity, and they attracted around 60 participants each. So I think that's a brilliant level of engagement. I don't think we could have wished for more really on that front, and it's excellent exposure for our contributors, and hopefully they all feel that this has been worthwhile. I don't know how people got on with Hoover and finding their way around that new platform. I certainly found it quite intuitive, probably after the first day or so, and pretty easy to use. And clearly a lot of you did too, because the community board has been very busy. There's been over 90 conversation topics started, and we hope they'll continue. And perhaps Liz could let me know how long that, that community board will be open for. After the conference. We've had discussions really gaining traction around links between energy poverty and health, experience and impacts of COVID-19, and the role of different organisations and intermediaries such as municipalities and community organisations. So that was really good to see. Also, we really like sharing our publications. That might come as no surprise to anybody working in academia. There's been almost 100 articles shared via the platform, which has created a great library and resource. I just hope that they were shared as PDFs, so people outside of academia can read those papers. That's a real bugbear of mine, or at least they're in some form of open access format. So that's quite enough from me, and I'm going to move on now to introduce our 4 panelists. So we've asked them in their talks to do rather a lot, actually, which I'm apologetic for, but we've asked them to look back and to look forward. We've asked them to reflect, if they can, on things they've heard over the course of the week that might have stayed with them or struck a chord, to reflect on the links between just and inclusive decarbonisation and energy poverty, to reflect on whether COVID will support or obstruct low carbon transitions in their view. We can't go through a day without mentioning COVID. And finally, to impart, if there's time, 1 or 2 messages to policymakers charged with taking forward decarbonisation in a just manner. And we'll try and capture that advice and put it out through social media. So, panellists, we've asked rather a lot of you there, but if you're able to just reflect on at least some of those themes in your talks, we'd be very grateful. Perhaps you pick 1 or 2. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. This is Professor Gordon Walker. Gordon is a professor in the Lancaster Environment Centre at Lancaster University in the UK. He has a profile of research on environmental and energy justice, the dynamics of energy demand, community energy, and zero carbon housing, to name but a few. And he's recently, this is very interesting, been applying the concepts and methods of rhythm analysis to energy and climate concerns, and has a book coming out on this in the next month, titled Energy and Rhythm Analysis for a Low Carbon Future. So that's something to look out for. So Gordon, you've got 10 minutes. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Amy. That was a really nice introduction, including to understand more about the sort of empty space that we talk into, and to know how well populated it was. Really very impressive. So I'm going to make 4 points. The first one relates to the field of work generally that's been represented here, sort of research work, but also practical and policy work. Broadly, we could characterise it as concerned with energy justice, transitions, just transitions, fairness and decarbonisation, all those key words. And from the evidence of the conference, that field of work is really flourishing. It's moving on at a pace, and there's some really important things going on, some really important advances in terms of the depth and the detail of understanding, the range of expertise that is being brought to bear, diversity of voices, and the range of contexts and concerns that are being examined. Every time I've been able to dip in and listen and look at presentations, I've been really impressed across this broad field. And in that respect, I found myself reflecting on 10 years ago when I was involved in running a networking project that a number of people who were at the conference were also involved in, called Inclusive, which stood for Interdisciplinary Cluster on Energy Systems, Vulnerability and Equity, which was very much in the same space, and it generated this book, Energy Justice in a Changing Climate, Social Equity and Low Carbon Energy, that I also flicked through just to remind myself where we were at 10 years ago. And we had some great meetings, some great events, but it was very much then about building on the foundation of work that had been done on energy and fuel poverty to sort of broaden the agenda to say, wait a minute, we need to think about justice and equity and fairness across a broader field of energy system concerns, across a range of different decision-making points, and very much in the context of, at that point, thinking about decarbonisation and transition at a sort of early stage in terms of those concepts being developed. And at the time, the vocabulary that we were using was a bit underdeveloped. The ideas were a bit marginal compared to others within energy policy, and really it was all sort of a bit narrowly conceived. We were trying to broaden things, we were trying to open things up, but looking back, it seems like it was quite sort of basic in a way compared to where we've now got to, and I think that's really positive in that there's been a really demonstrable change. The questions that are asked are more sophisticated. They're being asked across a wider field. They're being asked earlier in processes, earlier in innovation processes and policy processes and design processes, compared to the sort of retrospective fitting in of justice that we were sort of doing at the time. I think the questions are being asked in a more searching manner about exactly how the vulnerable and the marginal and the poor are being affected or could be affected by what's coming down the track. And I think the sort of basic principles of justice and fairness and inclusion are now more widely accepted and acknowledged than they were before. That doesn't mean to say there aren't a whole load of battles to still be fought, but I think a lot of progress has actually been made. And one thing that's really stood out for me is the internationalization of the field of work. So in Inclusive, we tried to be international. We held a meeting in Brussels, I remember. I think Stefan was at that meeting. And we tried to engage a sort of European Union dimension at that time, but there was just very little there. It was very hard to generate any strong connections and lines of sort of influence at that point at a European level. And I think that's really moved on far more than I actually realised listening to some of the presentations. We even, for our sins, held a meeting in America, and we tried to find out who in America was talking about energy poverty, and the answer was almost nobody. It's still a bit like that, but actually I've now started to see things move even in the States. And I think that internationalization is really important, not only because energy poverty matters everywhere, but also because it matters in different ways. And that came up on a number of presentations in a really clear way, that context matters enormously to the nature of the problems and the processes within which justice needs to matter in decarbonisation. So it's about infrastructural context and infrastructural histories, political context, cultural contexts, and certainly climatic contexts, like physical context, can really matter as well. And I'll come back to say something a little bit more about that in a moment. So my second point is the range of Ds that have been talked about at the conference, and you'll see what I mean in a moment. So decarbonisation clearly has been a very vital topic and focus for discussions, and there are lots of excellent examples of the range of different things that decarbonisation actually means and attaches itself into, and all of those we have to think about fairness and justice in relation to those. We've also been talking about what I call increasingly called de-energisation as a sort of counterpose to decarbonisation, which is about obviously using less energy, reducing demands, particularly in the wealthy global north, high levels of energy consumption and so on. De-energisation, making decarbonisation more possible, making it fairer. And I think a lot of presentations were talking about that conjunction between decarbonisation and sometimes called energy efficiency, but I think we need to look beyond just efficiency to more fundamentally reducing demand as well. And part of that, another sort of de-energisation move in a way, is to talk less about energy and more about energy services. And again, that's such an old argument, but it has to be continually repeated. And I think people were saying that in more interesting ways and talking about regulation for energy services rather than energy as well, which I thought was a really interesting development. The other important D was decolonisation. I heard that word used a few times, and that was interesting and not necessarily something that I'd expected. In a way, it was used as a catch-all by some people for talking about the diversity problem in the energy field generally, the traditional domination by a narrow demographic and disciplinary background, and crucially what that means in terms of the mindset within which energy problems have been approached, thinking about how change happens, why people do what they do, how people think, what matters and what doesn't matter, all of that sort of being approached through a very sort of homogenized and narrow mindset traditionally. And I think we see in this conference lots of emphasis upon diversity and inclusion and opening up both our understanding of the problem of energy poverty, but also who is engaged in it, who is working in it, who is researching in it, and who is seeking to understand it. But decolonisation is also about where ideas come from, how ideas circulate, how they travel, how they become applied. And I didn't used to call it decolonisation, but I've always thought that this field of work had a problem in that sense, because there was so much reference back to the UK all the time. And because of that, some basic things that were just very UK centric flowed out across the work in the field. In particular, the emphasis on heating, that fuel poverty was always about affordable warmth. It makes a nonsense. It doesn't make any sense in some other parts of the world. And what I really liked in this conference was a number of attempts repeatedly of people saying, well, how about cooling? Remember cooling? And that is really vital, because I remember in Inclusive, I was sort of getting out of the British mindset during that process. And I was trying to say to people, well, how about cooling as an essential energy service? And the number of times you just got back this reaction that say, well, cooling is a luxury. How can you call about cooling as an essential need? And that is such a colonial mindset. And it's really good that we're sort of getting away from that and recognising that what energy poverty means and what energy matters is something which isn't constant across the world. There is that contextualisation that we always need to do. On coronavirus, so rattling forwards, I haven't got very long left now. Coronavirus, I find it difficult still to talk about coronavirus, to be honest, because it's so tragic and so painful for so many people still. But it's, on the other hand, it's so hard to avoid. What I have observed is some really uncomfortable, not at this conference, but in other arenas, some really uncomfortable parallels between how excess deaths are talked about in the energy poverty field, excess winter and summer deaths, and the way that excess deaths were talked about in relation to coronavirus. You know, I actually saw the harvesting word used, and, you know, Jesus. So that's been very uncomfortable, I think. But on the other hand, more positively, and again, we saw some of that in the discussions at today's conference, realizing how much the right to energy had been able to sort of gain some foothold through the energy dependencies that have been really exposed by the sort of breaking of these rhythms of everyday life and rhythms of society, really exposing this relationship between what we do and how we do it, and the way that energy use is part of our lives, and how that the sort of intensification of those dependencies for people in various circumstances really exacerbating problems of vulnerability and so on. I think the fact that some of that was exposed through what we've been through, and it added to the right to energy agenda and the sort of willingness of governments to go into that space, I think is a positive thing, if we can find some positives in all of this. And I'd hope that that can have some sort of continuity and some sort of roll forward into the future. And I'll finish there as my time's up.
Thanks very much, Gordon, and thank you also for keeping to time, but also fitting an awful lot of food for thought in there. I was kind of overwhelmed with all the ideas spinning off from what you'd said, but I particularly latched onto the idea, you know, this idea that we've always tried to retrofit justice in the past, and that links into a question that I wanted the panel to consider, which perhaps we'll have time to discuss later, which is around, are we in time in relation to this rapid decarbonisation agenda? We're having to do it in a hurry. How can we ensure that it's fair and just whilst under these huge time pressures? So if panelists want to pick that up in their talks, then great. If not, we can talk about that later. So in the interest of time, I'll pass straight on to João Pedro Gouveia. Now, we've changed the order a little bit, so sorry about that to the panelists. So João is an environmental engineer. He has a PhD in climate change and sustainable development policies. He works in the areas of sustainable energy transitions, smart and sustainable cities, energy poverty, climate mitigation and adaptation strategies, and building energy efficiency. So clearly a very busy man. He's on the management committee of the EU Cost Action on Energy Poverty, which is the Engager Group. And since January 2021, he's part of the coordination team for EPA, the EU Energy Poverty Advisory Hub that we heard about, I think, on day 1 or 2 of the conference. So, João, you've got 10 minutes to give us your thoughts.
Thank you, Amy. Also, thank you, Gordon, Stefan, and Brenda. It's really a pleasure to be here on this final session of our great event. So I want to give you a couple of reflections of the thinking around the conference and also what we have heard. So in my perspective and my learnings, working in the last years with very different regions and researchers from different backgrounds through Engager Network really allowed me to have this perspective and understanding that the problem of energy poverty, also as highlighted now by Gordon, is very diverse and being brought to the public and policy attentions in countries from really different perspectives. So this seems obvious, but indeed shows that there is no one-size-fits-all on definitions, on metrics, on the type of analysis, even on the primary stakeholders involved. But fortunately, I think we were able to get this sense here on this truly global conference. So, and drawing from the learnings and the insights of several colleagues in and outside Europe, it really allowed to open not only my perspectives, but I think it's a global sense that opened the perspective of the research in energy poverty that one might have when only looking to their own countries. So this was really a plus of the conference. As we have heard we have heard about energy performance gaps, we have heard about underconsumption, social housing, summer issues, inclusive social movements, coping strategies, low carbon heating technologies. So all this with solar integration and working with communities is really bringing a diversity of knowledge and even the fields working on energy poverty. So in my perspective, there is a lot of countries very advanced. We have seen it. Of course, we have the UK as the biggest example with multiple studies, several policies in place on revision stages of strategies and fine-tuning approaches. But then on the other end, even within the European context, and that's the one I know best, there is other countries slowly recognizing the problem, at the policy level, at the research arenas, focused on the approaches either on the lived experience or through interviews, and others more exploring the metrics and country scale analysis. So then there are others that really the governments are still lagging behind on all this. So the European push with the directives and then NCEPs are really relevant for this moving forward. So in my view, despite the diversity of approaches and backgrounds of the practitioners and researchers, there is a clear trend we can understand, especially on the measure side. So it's kind of, we know already the standard set of solutions around energy efficiency and renewable energy. So that's pretty straightforward, I would say. This will clearly allow, and we have heard in the morning sessions, to create these structured and systemic approaches with multiple positive impacts, not only focusing on energy poverty. So in this sense, also something we have heard multiple times during the conference that I would like to stress here is the importance of understanding, I would say, the renovation programs, the energy efficiency programs, behind just the paybacks and the targeting of objectives of reduced energy consumption and lower energy bills. This is not the reality on many of the countries, Portugal included. So with the problems of summer and winter energy poverty, this is really a matter of increased indoor thermal comfort, improved indoor air quality, larger macroeconomic health effects, as some of the panelists before have also mentioned. So we should be taking this as a perspective of healthier environments for families, with or without children, single or large families, with elderly people, disabled, and so on. So some of the conference sessions also showed new research agendas, kind of expanding. Might not be new, in some people were researching that already, but we have looked into different dimensions of the problem. So either trying to connect different forms of vulnerability, like transport energy poverty, or looking more in depth to the lived experience, looking to the house itself on gender issues, for example. So in my view, this is really interesting, but it brings an additional problem, and it's challenging due to the lack of data, maybe data protection issues when we are trying to look deeper into the households, and also the interlinks with other topics as urban planning or other dimensions of the cities and countries' development. So I would like also to mention the part of the regional perspectives, so the role of the regions as well. So due to its multidimensionality, as we all know, it seems clear the importance of looking at different scales from different perspectives. This is because, of course, we see that the usual triangle of energy poverty drivers is more or less common in all developed countries, and maybe I'll focus this part on developed countries. The ways to engage and draw attention to the problem at local and national authorities might be really different. So it is well recognized that comparing countries does not bring significant insights to solve the problem in national contexts, but it's vital for awareness raising. That's I would like to point out. I have seen that example in Portugal with our research and the indicators being used across EU, coming from the EPOV and so on, that, for example, the media talks about energy poverty either during cold spells or when there is an update of one EU silk indicator, so the inability to keep homes adequately warm, and that Portugal, for example, appears really poorly ranked. So that's where it's highlighted. Also, we see very different examples. We are the few here, and everybody kind of knows. For example, I would like to draw attention, for example, in Poland or other Eastern European countries, the discussion on energy poverty might be coming from air pollution problems, for example. Others might be derived by the housing stock, energy, and efficiency. So I think it's also important for researchers in countries, still not, especially the ones still not addressing properly energy poverty, to find the sweet spot on how to trigger public attention to policymakers and specifically looking to their own context. So what can trigger this to action? It's energy, it's housing, it's climate change, it's health, it's social agendas, or maybe intertwining several of them. So this is a critical thinking moving forward on energy poverty in different countries. I think that's my view. Also around the measures and how we target, I have this idea that the national strategies are with top-down guidance are not enough. So Lucy in the previous session also mentioned the importance of having the national strategies as at least as a framework for moving on with regional understanding and regional action. And as I've seen in various presentations throughout the conference, energy poverty really requires this holistic approach, underpinned by a joint strong effort at different levels, so local, regional, national, and European. And this is because, in my view, the targeting is really difficult and everybody's struggling, both researchers and policy makers, how to target the vulnerable consumer, who they are, where they live. So this multiple level and multi-sector approaches to energy poverty might kind of nuance that difficulty around. So also say that with this perspective at regional scales, that's what we are going to look forward to the next phase of the EPOV with EPA, the Energy Poverty Advisory Hub, and making the connections with the Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy. So we'll try to provide this technical assistance to municipalities implementing sustainable solutions with the view of alleviating energy poverty with several methods. So I think we should be looking to this in the future also as a multi-level governance and cross-sectoral cooperation to mitigate energy poverty. From my experience at the research side, I think, and as I just mentioned, that idea, targeting households is a bit complicated. So it's a problem of difficult resolution, in my view. So strictly using bottom-up approaches are that sometimes might be difficult to bring it to the country scale and be used in national policy. But on the other end, we have top-down that do not recognize all aspects of the problem with the different lived experiences and examples of the real lives of the families. So a combination of these approaches should be drawn at multiple scales with different targeted and non-targeted methods. On that idea, I would say that I think the renovation wave, and we have heard that on the second day, kind of sets the scene for this more structured approach to the problem. Because if energy efficiency is one of the core solutions, maybe the non-targeting feature of it might be relevant. So for example, the integration with positive energy districts, renovation scale at the district level, not exactly one house individually. It also might create economies of scale that will be relevant. On that perspective, and we have heard about that in the first hand on Monday from the first Portuguese renewable energy cooperative, the role of renewable energy communities to contribute to self-production and to support vulnerable consumers. And maybe to end now my introduction here, I would like to bring the attention to the Portuguese context. So and the part of funding and how to deal with this. So it's difficult. We know already it's difficult to fund the energy transition. There is a lot to fund, right? From renewable energy, from the parts of the building, so on. But the way I see it is that the governments usually choose the easy, more comfortable roads. Portugal is a world leader in integration of generation of wind and solar PV. Public concern about climate change is strong. We have seen feed-in tariffs. We have seen support for buying electric vehicles. More recently, highly successful utility-scale solar auctions, a significant interest in hydrogen production. So in my view, this is an easy to pursue. There are few market players, big companies, powerful lobbies. So what about families? What about the scattered markets? And from my understanding in Portugal, and this might be the example in other countries, so I do not see a significant improvement on energy efficiency and efforts on policy efforts for energy efficiency in buildings. So on that sense, that's why Portugal is one of the worst countries on energy poverty indicators. But since I would say 3 years ago, nobody talked about it. Not the government, not research. So this is kind of a combination of factors. So Portugal, as the building stock old and inefficient, both private and public, both households and public administration. Over half of the existing buildings were built without any concerns on thermal comfort requirements. Renovation rates are extremely low, so well below the EU average of 1%. Maybe we're talking about here with no strong statistics, but around 0.05% a year of renovation of the building stock. So when looking to 2050 to the decarbonization strategies, it seems a bit off how we can bridge the gap between this difference, the reality and the future. Also, The buildings renovation supply chain is broken. Delivery agents are lacking the appropriate knowledge and skills. We have heard about this also on the conference in different locations. High energy literacy of households. So people do not know what to do. Should I buy a solar PV, a heat pump, or should I renovate replace my window? So even in giving you a real example coming from Portugal, even with the tourism growth that we had, of course, before COVID, in major Portuguese cities, the opportunity for deep renovation of the houses was lost because there were created exceptions to the building's energy performance regulation to make it easier to renovate below the set standards. So lost opportunities here and there with different examples. So, and then on the other hand, looking to this vulnerability perspective, and I think I'm bringing the Portuguese idea here, but I think it's similar on other locations. Families are struggling. Portugal has one of the highest energy prices in Europe, looking to the equivalized costs. It happens not only in electricity, gas, but even yesterday there was a front page in the Portuguese newspaper showing that diesel and gasoline, Portugal was also the fourth country with the highest energy prices for transportation. In 100 euros spent by the consumers, 60 euros go to the state. Another example, liquefied petroleum gas bottles in Portugal cost the double than in Spain, the neighboring country. So you see here that the vulnerability of the combination of vulnerabilities coming from the infrastructures to the buildings or coming from what's happening in the families is really making the countries, and specifically in this case, what I'm talking about, Portugal, a real hard problem. COVID-19 really increased this impact. And thank you. I think for now, it's it.
Thanks very much. Well, the panelists so far are very, very adept at cramming in a huge number of themes into their short slot, which should give us a huge amount to talk about, I think, when we get to the Q&A. And thanks also, Joao, for giving us, I think people are always surprised when they hear about how bad energy poverty is in Portugal. I think you've just given us in a nutshell some of the key reasons why that's the case. There's a few themes in there that I hope we can pull out in the discussion, and that perhaps other speakers, the remaining two panelists, can pick up on a bit. So I was interested in what you were saying about how the triangle of drivers, as you called it. I think you're talking about the kind of idea that fuel poverty is driven by low incomes, high prices, and low energy efficiency is still very, very prominent in policy making, even though I think I think understandings have moved beyond that now. And we've certainly got a more nuanced understanding of the drivers of fuel poverty. So I'd be interested in views on that. You talked about how comparing the experience of different countries or even regions, doesn't achieve a great deal. And I would counter that, yes, but sharing knowledge really does. And certainly sharing case studies, I think, can be really, really useful. And you talked a lot about the role of action at different scales, kind of multi-scalar action, and perhaps we can reflect a bit on the different roles of different levels of policy making and action if we have time. I also picked up on the fact you said that government takes the easy routes. That's worrying, isn't it? I think you're right, but ensuring fairness under very tight timescales is really hard. So how can we convince them it's worth doing? And then finally, you talked about how can we get the public's attention on this? And I thought this would be a great segue into Brenda's talks. I think Brenda's got thoughts, which she's expressed previously, on how we get people engaged with energy issues when often people don't perceive that energy is a priority for them. So on that note, I'll pass on to Brenda, who might be able to pick up some of those strands.
Well, thank you. There's so much to talk about, isn't there? Thanks, Amy. First of all, I wanted to say that being part of this gathering, I don't know if I really call it a conference, but still this gathering with 423 participants, all looking at energy poverty from one direction or another, is completely and utterly marvelous. It is a fantastic legacy that some of us in Britain, Gordon and Stefan in particular, have helped to create. And it's just wonderful to think that energy poverty well, it is wonderful, but it's dreadful. It's being recognized around the world as you start looking for it. we had a presentation in panel 6 about the Netherlands, and as soon as you start looking for it, even in an advanced country like the Netherlands, you do find it. So that's true. So I'm delighted that the whole issue of energy poverty is stretching out in all of its ways into the different countries, different disciplines, different participants. The second thing I wanted to say, and I don't know whether Gordon would have joined me on this, is how sad it is that we have Brexit. All sorts of wonderful things that are coming out of Europe. I was looking at the renovation wave document a bit earlier and thinking, oh, fantastic, wouldn't it be great? And do you know what? We've got the first UK label on appliances came in 2 days ago. It's got the British flag in the corner. It hasn't got the lovely European circle. So we're now in Britain on a different path. How different, we don't know. And it's probably very sad. We're probably going to be lagging behind you, even though we were helping to contribute in the past. And talking about labels on appliances, one of the things that I heard, I think it was Gordon say about energy services and how we've got to remember that that's what we're really looking at. And yes, it was warmth and now it's cools and it's lots of other things. And please never forget that certainly in Britain, the energy performance certificate covers space heating, hot water and fixed lighting. That is less than half of the expenditure of a fuel-poor household on energy in Britain. And it probably is the same in many other countries. So if Europe is doing good stuff, as it usually is, on labels and minimum standards, you are sort of covered, but we mustn't forget the need to make sure that that's also a just and fair approach to energy use, scrappage schemes or whatever it is. It's not automatic that the poorest people get the best and most efficient appliances, usually the opposite, just as with housing and hot water. We've got an increasing debate in Britain about fabric first. I know it's been around for a long time, but increasingly because of the electrification of heat and the introduction of heat pumps in particular, we need to make sure that the building is more energy efficient to start with. Otherwise, you've got high running costs. You have to put in too much capital into a too big a system. So the whole issue of fabric first is coming up the agenda, certainly in relationship to the privately rented housing stock in Britain. And that is also being highlighted in a debate that started with the fuel poverty strategy that's just been produced about the relationship between something that is cost effective and doing the worst first. I'm absolutely certain with my fuel poverty, energy poverty hats on, that we do the worst first, even if it is not patently cost effective. And a lot of the things coming out of this conference are to do with the role of money and cost effectiveness and in new ways. So that we've got to start saying, okay, if I can quote a lovely colleague from one of the energy efficiency conferences that I was able to attend way back then, he said, it may not be cost effective to save the planet, but we might still choose to do it. And that's a little bit where I come from. So let's look after the planet first. This emphasis on money we had a very good presentation from Louise Sutherland of RAP, introducing all sorts of issues in panel 6. And we've just had too much emphasis on the profits of the utilities. You know, if we're going to have a liberalized market, it's you and I that might benefit. It's the loyal and the fuel poor who are left with, the energy poor who are left with the most expensive tariffs, but it's not the shareholders. It is not the shareholders of these privatized companies who actually pay up and suffer. So And she was using the example of how network costs are frequently focused mainly on the residential sector, and that large numbers of the energy intensive industries do not pay all of those network costs that you and I pay. And the less they pay, the more we have to. So network costs and the design of the market and the design of the way that those costs are distributed has an adverse effect on the energy poor. And there is a considerable risk that as more people have photovoltaics on their homes, that's a trend that will get escalated, which would be bad. And we were talking about the need for things like carbon taxes and the way in which those will continue to hurt the energy poor. I'm quite sure of that, and that the need for things like time of use tariffs, which are undoubtedly coming with the smart meters that we're getting, it will take us to be very alert and very clever, and to work with people like Louise to make sure that any time of use tariff is actually beneficial for the fuel poor, energy poor. It's not a given that it will be. It has to be designed in. And I don't think we've done very well with the design of smart meters. We need to do better in future to make these new trends with the energy markets, if they've got to stay as markets, both just and fair. In terms of benefits, and going back in a way to cost effectiveness, one of the reasons that cost effectiveness is so often a very bad measurement method is that some of the major benefits, like improved health, like better mental health, are not included in the calculation. It's a very, very narrow calculation, just based on energy saved, usually. So we know that the energy poor have considerable health problems. We're not so good at identifying and measuring their mental health problems, but they are there very, very definitely. And I would think with COVID and the increased poverty that's coming with COVID, that those mental health problems will be increasing. And if you look at health, one of the issues that we increasingly are talking about, interestingly, increasingly in Oxford actually, is about pollution. We're largely talking about pollution as a result of traffic and too much carbon dioxide, NOx, particle, PM10, PM2.5 outside the house. But also there is a debate about the effect of wood stoves and burning inefficiently in the home. And that, of course, is a huge issue across very many countries in the global south. The way in which the smoke from a little stove, pile of stones and wood, can go into the house and cause problems. And we have to bring all of those debates into the debate about worst first. I'm interested in particular in many of the debates about scale. Yes, there are roles for the central government, increasingly, of course, over money, but it's also this local context that it is something, I think Gordon's put it, you know, it is a specific geographical area, it is a specific climate, it is a specific set of housing conditions and employment conditions. So the idea that the local authority has a major responsibility, both on monitoring and enforcement and delivery, is, in my mind, a necessary view to have. But of course, what we're also seeing in many countries is that the areas, the local authorities, the area-based approach isn't well funded, and must be. I think that that many of the papers that I've read and admired, or seen and admired, are about us becoming advocates, much more acting as a sort of in-between the institutions and the individual households, so that we're advocates, taking their perspective, whether it is with the utilities, whether it is with a tradesperson, whether it is over their fuel bills, whether it is in relationship to their landlord, that we have to help them. They're not often in a position to, I hope this doesn't sound too patronizing, but I don't think they're often in a position to take on the power and the ability of many of these players. So I hope, and I think that's where there was some talk about case studies. I think those are crucial to explaining the perspective of the fuel poor, the energy poor, and how they would need to be assisted. I mean, I've done some work on my presentations about the privately rented sector, and the interface between a tenant and the landlord is deeply difficult, particularly if the landlord doesn't really want to spend the money, even though there's a regulation out there. You can see a landlord going up to the tenant and saying, you don't want those improvements, do you? And somebody's got to stand up and sort of say, yes, they do, and this is what it's got to be, and etc.
Sorry, Brenda, well, just 1 more minute, if that's okay.
Yes,
yeah.
I've got 3 little policy issues, Amy.
Okay, can they fit into 1 minute?
Let me get going. I want us to label every house with its energy efficiency. The whole way in which appliances and labels and minimum standards on equipment worked was absolutely brilliant, but every appliance had to be labeled. We need to have every house labeled so that we all know what context we're working in and can start planning. I think in terms of the housing stock, you said, Amy, have we left it too late? That is a horrible question. We may well have left it too late, because the amount of work we've got to do with the 27 million homes we've got in Britain, and it's non-trivial work. It is really difficult. I live in a C-rated 1904 terraced house, and I do not know what to do next. And it's really difficult to see how I'm ever going to get this property to an A. So the whole issue of have we left it too late? Should we do things like talk and use that word I very, very rarely use, demolition? The homes in this country have got to last well over 1,000 years before they will be demolished, because we only pull down about 20,000 a year. You can divide 27 million by 20,000 and get to an even bigger figure. So what should we be doing about rejuvenating the housing stock? I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Brenda. I hate cutting you off because you're always raising so many relevant issues, but we are running out of time, actually. And I owe you a profuse apology. I forgot to introduce you properly. The discussion just moved on, and I'll make sure I give you a mention before I introduce Stefan. Okay, so there's an awful lot there that for Stefan. Stefan now inherits all of the themes that have been raised by the previous speakers. So no pressure, Stefan. Okay, so next, we have just heard from Brenda Boardman, who apparently is retired, so she alleges anyway, retired member of the Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford. She's still committed to helping the energy poor after 40 years of research and campaigning. And this year, I think it's worth noting, she was named as one of Radio 4's Women's Hours Power List, which focuses on women making outstanding contributions to our planet. And I think that's a wonderful recognition of Brenda's contribution to society over more than 4 decades. So sorry for missing that out before, Brenda. So next up in the final speaking slot, we've got Professor Stefan Buzarowski. He is Professor of Human Geography at University of Manchester. He chairs the Engager Cost Action, which we're very grateful to for funding this conference. And he's also a research associate of the Institute for European Energy and Climate Policy. So Stefan, over to you for 10 minutes, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction and the invitation to be here. Thank you for helping co-organize this amazing conference. with the whole of the Fuel Poverty Research Network. It's been absolutely stunning to see all these people and debates. For us, for Engager, it's our third event in the timeline of events that we've done over the years, and it just seems to be building on so well from what the other networks been doing. So an incredible enmeshing of the two networks, I'd say, over the last few days, and really looking forward to the period to come. Thank you also, not thank you for putting me last. It's all right, but now I've got the really difficult task of saying something different or new, or maybe not, because first of all, after such an incredible panel and after such a conference, what else do you say? I think one thing I could maybe talk about, I'll start with a few anecdotes, and I did have one slide, most of which now seems kind of obsolete, but I will show it just very quickly. Maybe there are some things that might have come up there. I mean, I've been in this field. I'm in this field thanks to Brenda. Brenda was my master's and PhD supervisor, and I started in, what is it, 99 now. So, and I remember going to some of the first conferences around this, and there wasn't anybody, and nobody knew about what fuel poverty was or energy poverty. It was very, very strange. And then I'm grateful to Gordon, because Gordon was one of the people who ran Inclusive, and out of Inclusive then flowed a whole range of projects that really developed this EU agenda as well. We had the ERC Engager project, we had a whole range of Horizon 2020s, and I think gradually there's been momentum, and now with Engager that's increased, and Fuel Poverty Research Network is absolutely astonishing what's happened. And there's real policy impact at the EU level, to the extent that Ursula von der Leyen mentions energy poverty, has mentioned it several times. So it's really up there in the agenda. I have to say one thing that maybe worries me a little bit is the way in which energy poverty has entered the European agenda. It sort of entered it through energy, which is okay, I guess, partly because of the whole way the EU is structured and the subsidiarity principle and so on. It's a long discussion, but this sort of mainstreaming of energy poverty within the energy domain carries with it lots of challenges. And one of it is, when Harriet Thompson and I, when we chaired the EU Energy Poverty Observatory, so when we opened the first meeting, we had more than 300 delegates in that room, and it was incredible. We were thinking, where did these people turn up? Where are they from? And then we realized a lot of them were lobbyists, and they were coming from all sorts of private groups and so on. And what's really happened is that now this mainstreaming effort is resulting in everything sort of being proposed as a solution for energy poverty. And, you know, I mean, yesterday I was in a discussion with somebody about prosumers, and, you know, prosumers is a solution to energy poverty. And Brenda brought that up in her talk, you know, with dynamic pricing. I mean, you know, I have a range of projects working with people on the ground. And I think, you know, the person who, you know, some of the people who are struggling with the energy poverty, not just struggling with that, there's a home in which someone has mental health issue, there's issues, the home is hoarded, they don't have access to, you know, they're struggling to pay for their bills, they don't have access to health services, they don't have access to social services, they're very low income, one light bulb, and you're thinking that you're now expecting these people to become prosumers and to be participating in the energy market. We know that energy poor people are time poor. They're excluded in all sorts of ways, but somehow, I have to really counter this idea that cooperatives and so on, which are a great idea, but they are a very middle class idea, somehow that they will solve this energy poverty problem. I'm very skeptical of. We really need to think of in this visceral reality, who the people struggling with bills and energy poverty are. And they are not your typical middle-class consumer. And sort of an imagination is emerging that this is going to be so easy to solve because, you know, and we've got all these cool new technological solutions, and that's going to solve. I mean, I went to a conference where people were saying, "Oh, Bitcoin is going to solve energy poverty," you know. And so this is one of my major concerns. I think connected to that is also the complete depoliticization of energy poverty, and that this also really worries me. the more it becomes a technical issue, the more it becomes something that we seem to be able to solve through somehow neutral policy measures. This is not a neutral field. This is highly, highly political. It's steeped in values. A definition of energy poverty or fuel poverty is absolutely imbibed in politics, and so to think that this is not a political issue is absolutely very, very problematic. I have a very quick slide. I'm sorry, it's a bit naughty, but it's up here. I know the other presenters didn't use slides. I kind of want to acknowledge some of the projects that I'm working in and that I'm deriving some of the impacts from. So if that's okay, I will keep to time, I promise. Let me just, I hope you can see it. It's just sort of thinking about where we move on from here. Can you see it? Is it all right? You should be up there. So I would say, and this is something that's come up in the conference, a very central question is the issue of visibility. Who are the energy poor? I mean, that's obviously our understandings have emerged from a very basic perspective, now moving on to much more nuanced understandings through a whole variety of dimensions. But looking at how and what sort of data is being collected at the European level, even in countries like the UK that are obviously drifting away from that, not to mention outside of Europe, we are struggling. We worked with Caitlin Robinson on this. We're struggling to find out what the gender dimension of energy poverty is simply by looking at the data. Another issue is ethnicity. The question of inadequately cooled homes. Everyone's talking about it. Eurostat isn't collecting any data on that. Every 4 years, maybe. I'm on another project where we're trying to look at what's happening at the subnational level. Once you go down to regions in the European Union and you try to get data and try to understand things, it becomes very, very problematic. And very fundamentally, and I know, again, acknowledging the work of my predecessor, the previous speakers, the way of how we measure energy poverty and what these measures mean is very, very central. So I think what we really miss is a measure, and Brenda's done a lot on this, a measure that's applicable at the doorstep, but also then translates into statistics. The kind of statistics that we have are incredibly disjointed. We have these abstract statistics nationally, and then we don't know what to do at the doorstep. And I think that's partly because we use relative measures at the national level. And these relative measures aren't really relative. And again, to acknowledge Gordon's work on this, inside them, there is an absolute measure. So we need to start understanding what those absolute measures are. I would like us to start thinking about baskets, of energy baskets at particular level. What is actually needed for someone to live? What is that because at the core of that is that sort of social consensus around what energy is, and so the social contract, which needs to be laid bare. And that's the very, very political central question. What does somebody need? And that brings in also the low carbon transition. The nexus connections of energy poverty with all sorts of other sectors, still we have so much to do on that. I'm surprised nobody's talking about water in the context of climate change. It's absolutely central. Transport has been mentioned. I'm in a project with Mari Matiskainen in CREDS on transport. But fundamentally, questions of urban and regional planning, the housing sector, what we do with that, absolutely vital. The question of recognition for me is, I think, still a big one. The fact that all of the policies and the measures we see, so many talk still about behavior change, about literacy, about teaching the energy poor what they need to do. I think that's absolutely a giant problem. The kinds of people I work with, yes, they might struggle with energy, with bills, but they don't struggle with energy bills more than anybody else. In fact, most energy poor people, at least, again, and I can talk about the projects that I'm in, are actually very, very good at economizing and finding ways to reduce their energy. And I've been asked in so many projects to find ways of getting people's energy bills down through consumption decreases. Absolutely ludicrous, but we're still kind of facing that situation where it's firmly believed that behavior change is something that's going to help the energy poor. And here, around that question of politicization, I'm going to try to keep this very, very general. In a different project, we need to start, we had an experience where we started looking at some of the very big structural questions around how the housing sector is regulated. And immediately we came up against some very, very serious barriers, which come from which originate at the nexus of particular interest groups perceiving certain things. I'm trying to speak in very general terms, but also how everything is framed in political domain. We can't have that unless we, the energy poverty is about progressive politics. Like it or not, you cannot articulate an energy poverty policy without thinking of progressive political alternatives. The two can be somehow disconnected, I think is very, very problematic. Finally, I want to say something about just transitions, and particularly the way in which just transitions are framed. Engager has another conference in 2 weeks called the Energy Rights Forum. Hopefully this will come out a bit more there. But we are still seeing just transitions being framed as a supply side issue. So it's all about more jobs. It's more about investing in particular industry. The energy transition, low carbon transition, is fundamentally about transforming the housing stock. It's about the mundane things that make up everyday life. And the idea that you can just invest in particular industries or regions, great, but you also need to enmesh yourself in the very, very complicated experience of everyday life, something that was talked about these days, and think about what happens at that scale. Without further ado, we can discuss what that means, but the experience of energy efficiency measures, the response of households towards heat decarbonization, the way in which particular measures discriminate against particular households, the new inequalities that emerge in the low carbon transformation process. Again, I will mention the work particularly of my colleague Mari Martiskainen in Sussex, who've done excellent work on this. That to me is very, very central when we start talking about just transition, as opposed to the idea that we can just transform regions through supply side investment. Demand really, really matters, and it matters across the board. And it's also highly political and spatial. I don't know how long I took. I hope I didn't take more than 10 minutes, but that's all I want to say. Maybe we can say something about Engager if you want to, Amy, and sort of reflect on some of the opportunities ahead. I don't know how much time is left, but maybe that's something we can bring up in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. That was brilliant. Yeah, time has done its weird, stretchy thing, and an hour and a quarter's just disappeared. I'm not sure where. So we're actually running out of time for questions. So there was a lot I wanted to sort of pick out and discuss from those presentations, but I'm going to open it up to questions from the floor to give people a chance to ask their questions of the panel. So hopefully they should start being fed through to the chat shortly. And then what we'll do, Stefan, is we'll hopefully there'll be a couple of minutes left at the end for me to talk about things we've got planned in the follow-up to this, and you could add some insights from Engager there. That would be brilliant. Okay, so yeah, questions are already coming in. I wonder if I might take a chair's prerogative and ask a question. So I really related to the idea that Stefan just put forward about when you kind of mainstream an agenda like this, you get a sort of bombardment of solutions and ideas. And I think what's coming out over the last few days is we're really starting to get to grips with the complexity of the problem of energy poverty, and that's really difficult to work with. And I felt like the policymakers that presented over the last few days are trying to find ways to sort of to simplify this and make sense of it, to aid them in their policy making. And perhaps that's where this kind of this desire to depoliticize it also comes from, and to find the technological silver bullet. So I wondered if the panel have any reflections on the fact that we still seem to be working with quite a simplistic explanation of the drivers of energy poverty, the low income, high cost, low energy efficiency triangle. Anybody like to go first? Yeah, go for it, Stefan. Yeah.
I mean, I can say very briefly, I think we've now got quite a pluralized understanding of the drivers. So yeah, I mean, in some circles you do hear this sort of the triad being mentioned. and the triad isn't losing its relevance, but we're starting to look much more beyond that. I think justice approaches have, for example, they've become pretty mainstream now, and they draw attention, not to go into sort of Gordon's territory here, but they've really drawn attention to some of the wider distributional questions around decision making and recognition and so on. I think certainly in among a whole range of researchers, and you can see now this in the Scottish definition, there's much more attention towards a fourth dimension, which is how energy is used, which I think is very important. So I don't know, I think we've kind of moved that. I think sometimes it's repeated, but then you can see it being challenged as well. I don't know. I think I'm not sure I'd agree that we're still working with one understanding, that we have many, and I think that's kind of okay, especially if we start looking globally, that maybe is not easily applicable to the whole of the world. So.
Thanks, Stefan. Does anybody else want to add anything quickly there? We've got quite a lot of questions coming in, so we'll move on shortly, but any thoughts there? Brenda, I think you wanted to come in.
Well, I was just going to be a bit, I suppose, controversial and say, we can make it too complex. It is important to understand ethnicity and gender, and they're all aspects, but in some ways, in terms of policy, maybe we just need to keep it relatively simple. We need to do a whole street or a whole area and just deal with the problems behind every front door as they emerge and as we have to confront them. And that will tackle all of the different aspects that we know are there in society. But it's a little bit like, as Stefan said, I've been critical of some of the definitions because they don't work on the doorstep. We just have to focus on the doorstep a little bit more, the doorstep in a whole area. And I really like the idea that you draw a red line on the map and you do every property within that red line, and then you do another red line, and all these red areas join up to be a whole local authority over 10 years or whatever it is, and that we just need to get on with it.
Thanks, Brenda. I really like this idea coming out about looking for solutions that work at the doorstep and definitions that resonate at the doorstep. So hopefully someone can tweet that and it can really take off as an idea. I'm going to move on to some of the other questions now. Sorry if people wanted to come in. There's a question here from our very own Graham, which is an interesting one. He says, how do we balance the urgency to help the worst cases first, which is something Brenda really emphasised, with the risk of the energy poor becoming guinea pigs for new approaches and solutions? I suppose that's is that one for you, Brenda?
I suppose so. A lot of the solutions are not particularly new technology. It is the cost of doing a solid wall insulation. It is the problems of doing a solid wall insulation when you're in a attractive townscape. It is the problem of doing more insulation before you do the heating system. I'm not sure that the guinea pigs bit comes into it. I think we hope over time that, just as has happened with photovoltaics, that many of these technologies will become cheaper, especially everything to do with solid wall insulation or something similar to that. But Graham, I don't think it's necessarily new technologies.
Thanks, Brenda. I think, Gordon, did you want to add anything there? You seem to be sort of nodding a lot in agreement with Brenda.
Just nodding a lot.
Just nodding.
Brenda was generally right, and she was right on that occasion, I think.
Yes, I think we all generally think that.
One of the general things I wanted to say to policymakers is, in a way, is actually learn from experience. It's deeply frustrating that when things do work, they don't get sustained. And we've known that area-based approaches, doorstep approaches, work from some fantastic examples, and then that just doesn't get sustained. It doesn't get scaled up and used in more and more places. We've known that for ages. It's really frustrating, and then they just keep on making the same mistakes over and over again. and it's just actually learn, actually do some sensible real learning, and don't keep on sort of trying out these things that you think sound like a good idea, but we know they don't work because they haven't worked in the past. They're not going to work again. And it's the same with this emphasis always on new stuff, innovation and so on. Some of the tried and tested things can actually work really well. We just need to use them and deploy them and fund them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think we're not very good at capturing good practice and sharing it actually in the right places through the right networks. João, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just a short insight here. So as we have seen, not all countries have the same amount of large social housing and even the public owned housing. So this perspective, which I totally agree, and we had a project last year working on this district scale and the links with potentially positive energy districts in a historical neighborhood. It's not an easy thing to do, at least from what I've seen in Portugal, because we have a lot of privately owned houses. So in a street where we have, I don't know, 1,000 different owners, it's also difficult to implement this. So it's something I struggle a bit to understand also how we can do that, because it makes sense. It allows us to not overlook the energy poor, but how to do it in practice. So how to support and to fund 1,000 different owners. So.
Yeah. And that's something I think that, you know, a big challenge for the idea of a renovation wave and the associated idea of these energy communities. Brenda might have thoughts on that, actually. I'm sure you've given some thought to how you do these area by area approaches.
Yeah, I do. It is a red line on the map. It's based, my original understanding was based on what they did in Northern Ireland, which was they first of all did some academic studies to find out where energy poverty was concentrated, and that's where they started. And in the worst areas, they found up to 85% of the households were in fuel poverty. That was Northern Ireland, and they do have special problems. But the doorstep is crucial. The doorstep is very simple, but the actual flexibility of what you offer is very sophisticated, both in terms of the actual interventions and the way that they are funded. You might need 10 different policies to cope with the situation you find behind the front door. Some people can fund it. Some people have got landlords. Some people haven't got any money whatsoever and will need 100% grant or something similar. So it's flexible technologies, very, very trusted installers. That's almost the most difficult thing in Britain at the moment. We don't have enough installers we can just say, go and do that house and bring it up to a C and know that they will do it well. It's just very, very difficult. So there's a lot of things interact, but I don't think there's any alternative to an area-based approach. And the idea that we keep on asking the utilities to go and find a fuel-poor house somewhere and do a bit of work on it, don't like it. Sorry.
I wondered if so there was a small piece of work done a few years ago that I came across recently. It came out of the USA and the Consortium for Energy Efficiency there about the keeping up with the Joneses effect and, you know, the role of kind of neighbour to neighbour information exchange and how that can sort of unleash a domino effect in a neighbourhood. Has anybody observed that in practice? Does that have any?
Well, let me just come back on that a bit, Amy. That's very much a middle class thing. Where the neighbourhood thing comes in for the fuel poor, energy poor, is that a lot of the households are scared. They're in such terrible poverty. The last thing they want to do is anything that might disrupt it and make it worse. And the only way, they'll never self-identify, they'll always close the door or not even open it. The only thing that I think might work with them, and I haven't tried it out myself or been involved in anything that did, is the community word of mouth. That your next door neighbour, Mrs. Smith next door, had it done, and she says, I'm so much warmer this winter, it's absolutely lovely. And they didn't create a mess, and they were very nice. They came in and I gave them cups of tea, and just it worked for my household. And you begin to make Mrs. Jones realised that it could work for her. But that also means that you've got an area-based approach which goes over many years. I mean, you're not just talking go in for 1 year and come out. You're talking be there, you know, the little yellow van is going to be there in 3 years' time as well.
Yeah, definitely a long game. I'm going to jump to a different question from Mary Martis Kanan. She's always good. She always submits a good question. So this is hopefully one that most members of the panel can contribute something to. So she says a lot of people living in fuel poverty already live quite low carbon lifestyles. Should we be asking what we can actually learn from them in terms of decarbonisation? Who would like to kick off on this one? Gordon looks keen.
I don't know if I was keen, because you get into really tricky territory there about why they are living a low carbon lifestyle. And it can be a bit dangerous to sort of glamorize the low carbon lifestyle without realizing actually what it means to live that. On the other hand, there are traditions of adaptation, I suppose we would call it, and of making your infrastructure work well, and of not necessarily just assuming that energy use is the way to achieve good outcomes, that we could potentially learn from. But it's that in that sort of sensitive territory where we have to tread quite carefully, I think.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Mary, you are slightly assuming that their low carbon lifestyle is a warm one or a cool one or a happy one or a whatever. I wouldn't assume that.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. Okay, unfortunately, it's a real shame that we can't carry on the discussion for longer. Really don't know where the time went. Perhaps I've talked too much, but we're going to wrap up now. I'm just going to quickly say a little bit about some of the follow-up activities we've got planned, so there is a legacy for this event and all the progress that we've made doesn't get left here. I'm trying to share a slide, however I can't actually see it anywhere, so I'll just have to tell you. Sorry about that. And I spent all that time making them look pretty as well. So we've got a whole range of follow-up activities lined up, and we will email this to everybody that's participated. So don't feel like you have to sort of scribble this down. And I won't go into reams of detail because we'll outline this in our follow-up email. So we've got 3 sort of sets of activities planned. One set around funding. We're planning to run an online, or perhaps blended by this point, you never know, sandpit / open space style session with small grants up for grabs for new collaborations between academics and practitioners. There'll be an emphasis on early career researchers and practitioners and on international collaborations, and hopefully that will run in the autumn of this year, and we'll be in touch about that. That'll be led by the Fuel Poverty Research Network. Engager will be running another round of short-term scientific missions, I understand, in the near future. I'll ask Stefan to just mention that in a moment, but there's a web link to the details of that we'll circulate. The Fuel Poverty Research Network will be running another round of small grants this coming autumn, and the Sandpit will be linked to the allocation of some of those, and we'll be announcing those who we've awarded small grants to in this first round in the very near future, so look out for that. The second sort of group of activities is around networking. We're also planning, the FPRN is planning an early career researcher and practitioner get together in the near future. We'll be in touch with that as the details emerge. We'd urge anyone who's not already a member of our mailing list to sign up. It's a GIST mail list. You can find the link at the bottom of our homepage of our website. It's a busy, vibrant mailing list. People share new research ideas, opportunities for collaboration, generally have a moan, have a bit of a debate. All sorts of things go on there, so it is worth signing up to. It's definitely one of those lists where things happen. We've also got a cluster of opportunities around writing. We have 2 special issues that participants in this conference can get involved with. So one is linked to the online journal, which is hosted by CRASA, the centre which I'm based in, which is the People, Policy and Place Journal. We will have a decarbonisation and energy poverty special issue coming up, and we hope to launch an invitation for abstracts by the end of this month, so watch out for that, and that will be exclusively for those who've participated in this conference initially, at least. And João is also running a special issue for the Sustainability Journal, which he'll mention hopefully in a minute if we've got time. We would also like volunteers to come forward to write a short blog summarising their experience of the conference and the main things they took away from it. As many contributors can come forward as you like, the more the merrier. So please do get in touch with one of the organising committee if you'd be willing to do that. It can be pretty short and sweet, and it'll be published on our website and syndicated on the websites of the various partners involved in this event. And we're also looking at a podcast series. There's a podcast series called The Energy Talk, which is hosted by a guy called Olu, who's a very charismatic host. And we're hoping that he will run a podcast for some of the key contributors to this conference to talk about the work that they presented at the conference. So again, we'll be in touch about that. So hopefully I've just briefly got time to go to Stefan on short-term scientific missions and Engager plans coming up, and then to João on special issue.
Thank you, Amy. So just for SDSMs, I put the link in the, oh, that was in the panelist link. I'll put it for the
we can send it.
Yeah, there it is. So yeah, I mean, people can apply for them. They're open. They're still open now. Obviously with COVID-19 restrictions, have that in mind. Please also go to the Engager website, because we do have a training school, which I believe is still accepting applications, and yet another event in 2 weeks, which I'm not entirely sure whether that's still open for participation. But watch this. Go to our website. It's just that one. There are going to be many other events coming up. For now, virtual, but hopefully when if things reopen, there'll be another conference and all sorts of other meetings. So do join that sort of more European sphere if you're interested in that. Engager technically is meant to finish in November, but we will ask for a corona extension, basically, to maybe for another year or so. Thank you, Amy.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks, Stefan. There's a lot to look forward to there, I think. João, do you want to mention your special issue in sustainability?
2 seconds. It's about, of course, energy poverty, sustainable mitigation, and it's available on the link, the website that you can check. Thank you. Thank you, Amy. I know.
Okay. So we just ran 2 minutes over time in the end by some miracle. I'm sorry that we didn't get time to discuss more, and I apologize to anyone whose question didn't get aired. You can always contact the panelists. Their email addresses are in the public domain. So I'd just finally like to thank everybody for their fantastic contributions over the last 4 days. I think the organisation committee have been blown away by the way it's all turned out, and it's all turned out very nicely, despite the despair we felt a few months ago when it became obvious we couldn't get together in person. So we look forward to seeing you all again at future events. And thanks very much. Look out for those follow-up opportunities. Thank you.